I'm going to be talking about terrain analysis and hydrologic modeling using digital elevation models and GIS. The purpose is really to discuss some of the methods and capabilities for using terrain analysis to enhance hydrologic modeling. This has been sort of a topic of my research and a number of other people for many years. And in the first part of the talk, I'm just going to go through a bit of an overview of some of the ways GIS is used and enhances our capabilities in hydrology, and then I'll get into some of the details of stream delineation and some of the things one can actually do with the GIS and some of the functionality. Then right at the end, I'm going to try and give a live demo of the tool that I've developed, Tardem, that works within ArcGIS. So I'm leaving the hard stuff for the end, so if it all crashes, then we've mostly had something. So one of the simplest things to do is actually that GIS and digital elevation models is useful for is just delineating model elements. Here we see a watershed that has been delineated from the topography, and it's useful to divide a watershed into sub-watersheds for many hydrologic models. This happens to be the barren sub-watershed that we used in the National Weather Service distributed model intercomparison project. Once the watersheds are delineated, one can then construct a logical network that links the watersheds to stream reaches and incorporate that into flow models that route water down the streams to get the flow at the outlet. One also can use the spatial framework to estimate the rainfall inputs. Each dot on this map here represents the center of a 4 kilometer square NexRad radar grid cell, which is the grid of rainfall information that we were using in the DEMA project. And by basically averaging over the grid cells, the dots that fall within each watershed, one can get the distributed rainfall inputs to the model elements. And you can make the model elements as small as you like, keeping within your computational limitations. The GIS is also useful for integrating the other sort of spatial inputs that one uses in hydrologic modeling. Topography, soil types, which are often used to characterize things like hydraulic conductivity, infiltration capacity, and vegetation classes or land cover that are used to look at interception capacity, evaporation, conductance, or resistance, that sort of thing. Topographic parameters are a big thing in modern hydrologic modeling, where we use models like top model that rely on the wetness index, and we have developed methods to estimate the wetness index from digital elevation models, and this just shows the sort of wetness index distribution can be calculated for each separate sub-watershed and used in a distributed model. And then the GIS is also useful for sort of synthesizing the results that one gets. And here I just illustrate where one can look at measured and modeled information after applying a distributed model over a watershed and look, for example, at the inferred rainfall. It's inferred because it's interpolated, in this case, from rain gauges, the flow that's measured and the flow that's modeled, the evapotranspiration that's modeled given climate inputs, and then look at how well or how poorly the water balance happens to close. One can also look at hydrographs and other information at the outlet, but it provides a useful framework for pulling all your results together and synthesizing. One of the things that we've done with GIS is also look at terrain stability. A few years ago, I worked with some colleagues in developing a terrain stability mapping program that uses the infinite plane slope stability concept. I guess Montgomery and Dietrich have also worked on this quite a lot at Berkeley, and then looks at the space of the area you're modeling in terms of the slope and the contributing area, and parcels that up into unstable areas which would form to the sort of right of where the contributing area is large and the slope is fairly steep, and would map those as unstable, and where the contributing area is small and the slope is flatter, it's stable. So you can map from topographic space to sort of parameter space and map terrain stability. And then I've been teaching a GIS class with David Maymont, or David Maymont really teaches the class, and we just sort of listen in and contribute in a small way. And he has developed and promotes this concept of ArcHydro as a standard data model for water resources to serve as the basis for hydrologic information systems. And that has as at its heart representations of the hydrography, the drainage system, the stream network, and the channel system, as well as time series. And it provides a standard data format in a structured database for moving back and forth and interconnecting the information in this framework. And I guess I threw that in here because he's in charge of the Kuhazi Hydrologic Information System development effort, and I guess it'll probably be building somewhat on this work. So now I'm going to move into the work that I have specifically done, and what I'm going to cover is talk about digital elevation model based flow direction and contributing area calculations. I'm going to talk about channel network delineation, and a lot of channel network delineation is done according to a support area threshold based on the contributing area. I'm going to talk about how that can be put in an objective framework and also can be extended to represent variable drainage density. Then I'll talk more generally about terrain flow fields and their numerical representation, and some of the multiple flow direction approaches that have been developed, and how those lead into specialized grid accumulation functions that can be useful for other purposes, for example, for water quality, for sediment transport, and things like that.
Dave, can I ask you to speak up just a little bit?
Sure. Is that better?
Yeah, thank you.
So this is the numerical representation of a spatial field. Going back to the basics, a lot of the work we do is with a digital elevation model that represents a spatial surface here, and we can represent it as a grid where you have elevation values representing the elevations at grid cells, or a triangulated irregular network, or contours and flow lines. Those are sort of three of the data representations that have been developed. All of the work that I described today will be in the grid framework, because the National Elevation Data Set data that's available in the US is in grid format, and it's also the easiest to work with, although it's not necessarily the best for representing topography. So a digital elevation model grid defines geographic space as a matrix of identically sized squares, each holding a numeric value that represents the topography in this case. Given a digital elevation model grid, we have a conceptual model that basically says where the water goes. We refer to it as the 8-direction pour point model, or D8, that basically calculates from any grid cell the flow direction to one of its 8 neighbors in the steepest downslope direction, and then encodes a flow direction at each grid cell. Those encoded flow directions basically represent a grid network, and then given that, one can do things like count how many grid cells drain through each grid cell, and that gives you the drainage area once you multiply it by the size of the grid cell. One can also apply a sort of stream ordering methodology where you take each source branch in this grid network as a first order branch, and then when 2 or more first order branches join, you get a second order branch going on, and that gives you a grid order. Then options for actually mapping the streams come from applying a threshold to the field that results from either the drainage area or the grid order, or some other fields I'll talk about later on. So this gives the stream network that's delineated using a 100 grid cell constant support area stream delineation threshold. And you're going to see a slide like this, or very similar to this, quite a lot. And I'm going to ask you to appeal to your sort of topographic intuition. And if you cast yourself in the role of a cartographer, ask yourself, would you draw blue lines where the algorithm is drawing them on the map, or do you think the algorithm is drawing too many blue lines or too few blue lines? Because the support area threshold that one chooses dictates how many blue lines are drawn, and we want to try and get that correct. So this shows with 200 grid cells, and you can see there's much less detail in the stream networks that have been delineated. One can also apply some of the other approaches. I spoke of the grid network ordering approach. That was first, I guess, advocated by Scott Peckham, and this shows where I've got a color scheme denoting increasing order as sort of brighter color with thicker lines, and if one applies a threshold to that, one also gets a depiction of the blue lines that tends to represent a little bit of the variability in the topography, because it's got some more detail in this region here where the topography is more rugged and crenulated, and where the topography is smoother, there's less detail. Montgomery and Dietrich in a science paper back in 1992 suggested, based on physical arguments, that perhaps area slope to an exponent should be used as a threshold for delineating channels. And this is the result that you get if you use that approach. And although it's got a nice theoretical justification, it tends to result in this sort of feathering effect where the terrain is steep and introduces what seem to be spurious channels here, whereas where the terrain is flatter here and some of these crenulated parts where it's flattered, it doesn't result in channels being mapped there. Then this is an approach that I guess Purka and Douglas published way early on in the sort of GIS era in 1975 for basically a filtering approach to try and identify stream networks. They suggested looking at each group of 4 grid cells, and after flagging all the grid cells, unflagging the highest grid cell in that group of 4, then moving over to the next. The 48 is still, if you look carefully at these numbers here, this one on the right is supposed to correspond to the sort of block immediately to the right of the one on the left. So the 48 has already been unflagged because it was the highest point there. Then 54 gets unflagged. Then when we move over again, the 58 gets unflagged. So after we've unflagged all the highest grid cells, one is left with a pattern like this that tends to follow the valleys, but it's not really connected up. So it's not that ideal for trying to map stream networks from topography, because we want our stream networks to be continuous. So one approach to making them continuous is to actually go back to the contributing area idea, but count the contributing area only of those grid cells, not of all the grid cells. So it becomes effectively a weighted contributing area calculation, and that's what we see here. And the color scheme effectively gives you a series of different thresholds that one could apply to that. And if one picks a threshold of only the upward curved grid cells, one maps a stream network that looks like this. And again, appealing to your topographic intuition, think which method looks the best to you in terms of actually mapping the channels right relative to this topography. So we've got a question that's posed from all of this: how to decide on the stream delineation threshold, be it a constant support area threshold just based on contributing area, or the number of upward curved grid cells upstream, or the grid network order. If you've applied a stream ordering scheme to the grid network, one still has to pick a threshold, and that threshold is going to be tightly related to the drainage density of your final network. And do we want to get a stream network, well, do we want to choose that arbitrarily, or do we want to have some objective way to choose it? You might ask yourself, why is it important to worry about that? The reason I think it is important is that hydrologic processes are really different on hill slopes and in streams. And it's important to recognize this and account for this in models. Models will typically have a different way of saying how water moves within the hill slope portion of the landscape versus in the channels. That's exemplified here, where we have drainage area in channels is really concentrated. So we think of drainage area upstream of a point. But on a hill slope here, we don't talk of drainage area upstream of a point. We talk of the specific catchment area, which would be the drainage area of the flow path upslope of a contour width divided by that contour width. So we're looking for some way to objectively determine the stream network drainage density. So we have this correct partition between dispersed flow and concentrated flow in our representation of flow in a hydrologic model. This just shows some of the differences that might result. One thing that's often done is to actually delineate model elements based on the stream network that's mapped. And then these model elements will be fed into a hydrologic model that maybe has overland flow processes down the slopes of the model element. Then when it gets into the channel, you have channel routing processes modeled. Well, if you have different model elements, you will have different lengths of overland flow. For example, if we have these large model elements saying that there isn't a channel here, whereas with this threshold we say that there is, we will model overland flow over longer distances and channel processes over a lower density of channels. So you're going to get a different result, not necessarily because your model's wrong, but because your spatial discretization might be inconsistent with the topography. So now I've got a series of slides to try and drive home the point to you that topography is really different from place to place. Maybe if you've hiked around outside, you don't need convincing of this. But here we have on the right a topographic map from Southern California and another one from Pennsylvania. These were both drawn from digital elevation models, the same scale, the same contour interval, and there's a lot of difference between the sort of ruggedness on the one on the right and the one on the left. Now I just go through a series of photographs that show topography. So here we see some of the mountains in Northern California, fairly rugged topography, steep, and contrast that with badland topography, contrast that with sort of gently sloping convex landscapes. These are some of the extremes that I was able to pick out of some geomorphology books that show that there really is a lot of variability in the topography, and we probably don't want to just use a rule of thumb approach for delineating stream networks based on digital elevation models. Some more badland type topography that's different from some of the previous ones, and then this is from the Pacific Redwoods in Northern California near Eureka. So the idea here, and this was written fairly nicely by Montgomery and Dietrich, is that landscape dissection into distinct valleys is limited by a threshold of channelization that sets a finite scale to the landscape. And that scale is going to vary from place to place. So my suggestion is that one contributing area threshold does not fit all watersheds, and to decide on an objective way to delineate stream networks, we are going to look at some geomorphology, because the basic idea is going to be that we're going to map stream networks from digital elevation models that are consistent with the observed and established laws of geomorphology. So just to briefly define for you what drainage density is, in case you don't remember that, drainage density is the length of channels divided by the drainage area. And if one thinks of a rectangular, or idealizes a watershed as a rectangle with hill slope lengths of B and channel length of L, the total area will be twice the hill slope length times the channel length. So the drainage density, when we divide the channel length by that area, becomes 1 over twice the hill slope length, or the average hill slope length is 1 over twice the drainage density. what you can get from this is that the units on drainage density are inverse length, and that it is the inverse of a length scale that's roughly the hill slope length scale. This just shows channel networks that result in different drainage densities mapped different ways. On the left is the EPA river reach files that are now the basis for the National Hydrography data set. And this shows digital elevation model mapped channels for Reynolds Creek experimental watershed in southwestern Idaho with different thresholds. And this shows the relationship between drainage density and the contributing area threshold that's used to delineate streams. And not surprisingly, there's a fairly well-defined relationship that has an exponent that's close to the exponent required for dimensional consistency of drainage density being an inverse length measure and area being a length squared measure. Now I'm going to start moving into talking about Huttons Laws, and those are all based on the Strehler stream ordering system, which probably doesn't need a lot of reminder to you what it is, but basically first order streams, source streams are first order streams. Where they join, they become second order streams. Where two high order streams join, the order is increased by one, and so on. And one has these empirically established relationships that then there's been a lot of theory done related to them too, that look at the number of streams of each order, and that ratios describes the bifurcation law. We can look at the mean area draining watersheds of certain orders versus order, and that is the area law. One finds that as you get to higher stream orders, the slope tends to decrease, and again you have the geometric progression with mean slope versus stream order that characterizes the slope law. Not one of Huttons laws, but another empirical observation that's useful is that for channels, it's been established that slope is typically proportional to the drainage area to the minus 0.5 exponent. So as drainage area increases, slope tends to decrease. This just shows an example that I developed, and there's a lot of scatter for the slopes of the individual links of the channel network, but when you average it together and smooth it, you get a fairly well-established relationship that breaks down at a certain point. And the idea is that where that breaks down, that says that this topography is no longer following the sort of laws that we know the channel networks follow, so that's where you should stop saying it's a channel network. And one also finds, and this sort of comes out of a combining of the slope and the stream length law, that there's typically along streams delineated according to the Strehler stream ordering, the change in elevation is roughly constant. So the exponent would be 1, or the line here would be horizontal. That's the relationship that we're going to key in on as the method for actually deciding what threshold to use to objectively delineate streams. So this just shows that relative to the stream ordering in a map. So we've got elevation measured at the source of a stream, elevation measured at the end, and the difference in elevation is the stream drop. Here I need to point out that the stream drop is actually over the total length of the stream, which may comprise many segments. A stream is regarded as a single stream for the entire length of its, or the entire part of its length where the order is the same. So right from there down to there would be third order. And the stream drop would be the difference in elevation between 1160 and 1114, which I guess is 46. So the suggestion we have for objectively mapping stream networks from the digital elevation model is to map them at the finest resolution consistent with the observed stream network geomorphology laws, and basically look for a statistically significant break in the constant stream drop property. That can also be related to break in the slope versus contributing area relationship. And there's sort of physical basis for this in terms of the stability theory that Smith and Bretherton developed that I looked at in this paper back in 1992. I'm not going to focus on these ideas today. We're just going to focus on the stream drop property. And this just shows you basically how it works. If one delineates a stream network from a digital elevation model and looks at the change in elevation along the lengths of all the streams of first order, second order, and so on, there's a lot of scatter. But one can calculate the means, and those are the sort of small purple dots. And those roughly adhere to the sort of constant drop property here. There seems to be a bit of an increase in the mean drop. What we're going to do is apply a t-test to see whether the difference in the drop with the first order streams is significant from the difference in drop from the higher order streams. Remembering that the t-test is the standard statistical test to look at the difference between means. So this sort of shows we've got a distribution of the drops from the first order, a distribution of the drops from higher orders, and the standard deviation goes into, and the number of points all go into the t-test. And the typical magic number with t-tests is if the difference in the t-statistic is larger than 2, then you have a 95% confidence in, or you have a 95% confidence that there's a significant difference, depending on your sample sizes. But typically our sample sizes here are large, so that's, that holds true. So the procedure is to apply that approach with a number of support area thresholds used to delineate streams. And this slide here shows where I had support area thresholds of 50, 100, 200, 300, 500, the drainage density that results from each, and then the t-test that results from looking whether the first order streams have a significantly different stream drop than all of the higher order streams. And in the graph above, we can see that I've actually plotted all of the stream drops and also plotted the means and confidence intervals calculated based on those means. And when we do that t-test, we find numbers that in absolute value are greater than 2 for the first 2 thresholds. So the first order stream drops here are smaller than for the higher streams. But once we get to a threshold of 200 and higher, the t-value is not greater than 0, not greater than 2 in absolute value. So we say that there's not a significant difference shown here. So we would pick a threshold of 200 in this case. One could, I suppose, go and try and refine the process and say, well, let's look at 150 and see where the t-value turns out for that. And sometimes we do that. But generally, the difference here, we've pinned down the drainage density to between 1.7 and 2.3 inverse kilometers. So it's been determined within the sort of precision that one can really get out of this. And there is the map that we get from this support area threshold. So now I showed you the bunch of maps at the beginning. Ask yourself whether you think this is roughly the right drainage density for this topography. I also described methods based on the upward curvature, the number of upward curve grid cells draining to each point. And there's still a threshold to be chosen there. So here we apply exactly the same idea. I've mapped stream networks with different curvature contributing area thresholds, 10, 15, 20, and 30. The drainage density, calculated the drainage density for each of those, and again looked at the t-statistic. And the first one, in other words, the highest resolution stream network that does not have a significant difference is the threshold of 20 with a t-value of minus 1.3. So we can look at this map. Now this map is fairly similar to the one I showed with a constant support area threshold of 200. So they're getting roughly the same drainage density. but because we've used the curvature approach, you can see that if you look carefully, it's actually giving you a little bit more detail in the area where the topography is highly crenulated, and less detail in the area here where the contours are far apart and the topography is smooth. And so it's capturing some of the spatial variability in drainage density that we see. So it has this ability to represent spatially variable drainage density. This is actually my sort of favorite approach for delineating stream networks, and I think this gives you a good answer. So I'm hoping you can look at that and agree with that. Now, all of this was based on the method that I showed right at the beginning of the 8-direction pour-point model, where we said we calculate the flow within the digital elevation model as moving to one of the 8 surrounding neighbors in the steepest downslope direction. Now, we all know that the topographic contours and therefore the flow lines perpendicular to contours aren't going to necessarily line up with our grid directions. This is one of the fundamental limitations when we're working with a grid representation of topography. So the D8 approach is going to take flow from this grid cell and put it either to the one below or the sort of one diagonally below to the left, where the flow should really be moving down perpendicular to the contours along a flow field that isn't limited by the grid that you're working with. It's really just a numerical discretization of that. So we're looking for a way to represent the flow direction field here that represents the surface better. This just shows, I guess we really have 2 ways of representing it. The 8-direction pour-point approach, we refer to that as D8, and that calculates the slope as the elevation drop divided by the distance. It's worth pointing out here that that's not necessarily the lowest neighboring grid cell, because in this case, the lower neighboring grid cell, the slope to it is actually less because of the diagonal distance being longer. Well, I have developed and published this in 1997, what I call the D-infinity multiple flow direction model. And that, instead of saying flow originating at a grid cell can go only to one of the 8 neighbors, basically fits a planar surface to 3 points. You might remember from geometry that 3 points are required to define a plane in space. So if we define a plane using the center point and each 2 neighbors, then each plane has a single steepest downslope direction. And if we look at the 8 triangular facets that are formed in that way and look at the steepest downslope direction away from the center point on those facets, one can define a flow direction away from a grid cell that isn't only to one of the 8 neighbors. It might fall in between 2 of the neighbors. And then the idea is that still, because we're working within a grid framework, we're going to then proportion the flow that originates in this grid cell between these 2 neighbors based on the angles. So flow direction is represented in terms of this angle here, and there's a proportioning to say where the flow goes. Given that proportioning, one can calculate contributing area, because if you've got a contributing area here, you say, well, 60% of it goes there, 40% of it goes there, so you can add up the contributing area just counting those proportions. This is the sort of a result you get. If you calculate contributing area using the D-infinity approach, you get the graph on or the map on the left. If you use the D8 approach, you get the map on the right. And you can see with the D8 approach, you've got a lot of lines that are streaked horizontal or at 45 degrees, which indicate that there's sort of flow parallel to one of the grid directions. The graph on the left is representing flow sort of perpendicular to the contours better, and it gives you a much smoother representation of contributing area. Now that matters when you, for example, are calculating the top model wetness index, because the wetness index is the ratio of well, log of slope, log of contributing area divided by slope. And if your contributing areas are different, your wetness index distributions are going to be different. And in the paper that we published this, we actually go and evaluate the difference it makes to the wetness index. We look at some ideal cases where the, let's say, flow out from a outward draining cone or on an inward draining cone or on a planar surface, and look at the sort of square errors and find that this d-infinity approach gives you a better representation of contributing area than this approach. So I guess that has been established based on a sort of a more rigorous analysis, although here I'm just showing you the intuitive sort of visual justification for it. Now one can take this contributing area idea and generalize it, and I'm going to now lead you through a set of sort of functions that generalize it and show you some of the interesting things that can be done. The simplest way of generalizing it is weighted accumulation. Instead of integrating by just counting the number of grid cells, one may have a weighting field. Perhaps this represents the rainfall over a contributing area. Then you'll be accumulating the rainfall. Maybe it represents a loading of a contaminant, and then you might be integrating the loading of that contaminant. Numerically, that's evaluated by just adding the loading at a grid cell to the contribution from the neighbors. And here we've got the sum where we look at the proportion from the neighbor that's coming in. So we're using the sort of multiple flow direction approach where flow is proportioned as it moves from one grid cell to another. There is a requirement that those proportions have to add up to 1 to ensure conservation, and there mustn't be any loops. In other words, you can't have sort of flow going round and round in circles, because then you'll end up with an infinite loop in the computer code, but also physically that's not what happens. One can then define things like the influence function. If one has an area of terrain here and basically looks at the accumulation of an indicator function that has a value of 1 in that terrain and 0 everywhere else, it'll sort of map the terrain that is influenced by this target area. And that might be useful, for example, to track where sediment or contaminant moves. If you've got some contaminant originating in this area, this is where it would go following the assumption that it moves down with the topography. So this just shows it starting at a target grid cell and then moving down. One can turn that idea around and define a dependence function, and that quantifies where flow comes from that hits a target area. So if this is your property here and you are concerned about what is flowing onto your property from upslope, you might be interested in the dependence function, effectively mapping how much of flow that originates at any distant point eventually reaches the target area. And that's a mathematical inverse of the influence function. One can also apply rules that describe how a substance moves that originates in a target area. When we were talking about flow accumulation, we initially assumed that we just basically counted the grid cells, or that would be equivalent to assuming an impermeable surface with all the water originating on a grid cell moving down slope. Well, maybe if it's a contaminant, there might be some decay, so you can build in a decay multiplier that might be related to a first order decay parameter that says whatever the substance is reduces as you move downstream. So you start changing the algebra of your accumulation function a little bit to build in rules about how the stuff moves. You can also look at concentration limited accumulation. Maybe the loading over your target area is limited by some sort of a solubility of whatever your contaminant is. And then as it moves downslope, it'll get diluted due to mixing with flow from the sides, and it also might be subject to first order decay, for example. One can look at sediment transport, and one of the concepts in sediment transport is that of erodibility, how much soil can get released into and then be free to transport away, perhaps due to raindrop impact. And there's also the concept of the transport capacity in the overland flow. Well, if you combine them, the transport out from any grid cell might be the minimum of the supply and the transport capacity. So one can build a rule like that into your calculation of your transport at each grid cell, and then the deposition would be the excess supply over your output transport capacity. And that can give you a model that in a natural way represents the sediment delivery ratio, because as you start looking at larger and larger areas, you get more sediment traps in that area where there's deposition, so you end up with a smaller ratio of sediment actually being transported out of the area. So it gives you, by looking at that spatially distributed approach, you represent the sediment delivery ratio naturally. One can also, instead of accumulating loading in a downslope direction, accumulate it in an upslope direction. You might ask, well, water doesn't flow uphill, so why would I ever want to do that? But you might be interested in the impact of activities upslope on something downslope, and the application here was to landslides. I showed you earlier that we had the sort of terrain stability mapping software that allows you to map landslide potential. Well, maybe if you, landslides are often triggered by water, by stream flow or by overland flow, and if you've got a lot of landslide prone terrain downslope from you, then you may want to be careful of the land management activities that you do upslope that might lead to increasing runoff. So what we've done here is we've taken the terrain stability measure and accumulated that upslope, basically counting back up the arrows rather than down the arrows, and that identifies that here is an area which was relatively flat, but it's got a lot of steep terrain downslope from it. So you may be careful about the activities that you do here, whereas this other terrain that's steeper does not have any landslide prone terrain downslope from it, so you don't have to be quite as careful with what you do there. So it provides a way to look at some of the sort of spatial connections between processes and the activities that may trigger hazards. So those are essentially all the functions that I want to show you, and I'm hoping to, by having done it, given you a bit of a flavor for some of the things that one can do with digital elevation models and GIS. And I guess by going through some of these last ones, I guess there's this idea that there's once one has a flow field defined, there's a lot of functionality that one could build into it. And currently, the way it stands, each piece of that functionality has to be coded separately. But one of the ideas that I've sort of raised is we really need to try and develop a flow algebra that allows us to express these ideas in a general way and then compute these functions in a general way, because then they'll become much easier to use. One won't have to code them every time, and there's lots of possibility for other sort of functions that one could build into that framework. Here I list some of the functionality that's in the Tardem software, which is what I've developed with my graduate students over the last several years, and it incorporates some of the sort of D8 approaches for delineating streams, the D-infinity approach that really is based on flow fields, and some other things that I didn't have time to describe today, like the routing of flow over flats, and some of these other functions like the downslope influence, upslope dependence, wetness index, and the like. So I guess that was going to be the sort of formal end of the seminar, and we could either take questions now, or I could move into where I try and demonstrate this within ArcGIS. And the last 2 slides beyond this are just some of the references that I've mentioned, giving my papers and papers from others that have worked on this. So you can sort of browse those at your will if you like.